Aku ini cinta, lebat semoga tercipta semua. Wahai Tuhan, bantu aku. Meski hidup ini selalu menyakiti badai pasti berlalu. Kecil pun merayu bincang hatimu. Cintaku tertipu takkan ada tindihan nada asmara. Ingin ku kembali ke masa remaja, serasa gali dan nyata yang ku mau kau untukmu. Meskipun kau tak rindu, engkau aku suka. Cintaku tertipu takkan ada tindihan nada asmara. Ingin ku kembali ke masa remaja, serasa gali dan nyata yang ku mau kau untukmu. Meskipun kau tak rindu, engkau aku suka. Cintaku tertipu takkan ada tindihan nada asmara. Kau kehidupanku meski kau tak tahu ada aku di hidupmu. Yang ku kau untukmu. Meskipun kau tak rindu, engkau aku suka.
Tes tes. Tes tes. Nah, kamu itu golden hearted girl ya, kayak mamamu.
Iya.
Enak enggak?
Oh, bisa belum? Tanya tuh. Ayo.
Hello, good afternoon, Prof. Cheng.
Hi. Hi, Dr. Aksa.
Is everything fine? Everything fine?
Yeah, thank you. Right.
I have asked the student to log in 10 minutes before
Okay.
1 o'clock, but I don't know. Many of them are still late. Mahasiswa tolong dihubungi teman-temannya, Mbak ya. So your university has already open for offline activities, Prof?
Some classes, not all. So students are back in campus, but they still log on most of the time from their rooms, the hostel for the online classes. Yeah. So
How about the physiology course itself?
physiology is mainly for the first and second years. So so most of those classes are still online, but I think that there should be more on-site, face-to-face. I think the next few months. Yeah. Last
How
year
about
was
the
completely
practical?
online.
How about the practical work?
We actually have very few practicals now. So last year it was a demonstration online. So,
Oh,
so
really?
there was no practical classes. Yeah.
Okay.
This year we may have not sure how the situation will evolve. We may have a few on-site practical. Yeah. But anyway, now we don't have so many practical. Yeah.
Can I join your class to see what you do in the practical course?
Practical course. If it is
Oh.
online, I will let the lecturer know if there's one in the coming weeks. Yeah. So
Oh, you don't have your own class for practical?
on my own, not my own class, because the practical is divided into 10 groups. So normally if it is online, so one lecturer will just explain to everybody. Yeah. So, but I normally don't have my own demo, except for second year renal physiology. Sometimes I explain some diuresis urine data. Yeah.
Okay. Do you use any particular application?
No, basically we give them some set of data, the urine data, and then they have to analyze the data, plot the curve, plot several graphs, and then one of us will explain the interpretation of data. Yeah. So there's no special app or anything. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Ini mahasiswanya kok masih sedikit ya? Bisa dihubungkan ke teman-temannya, Mbak ya? Ini dosen tamunya udah datang, mahasiswanya belum datang.
So the 8 students will join us as panelists, right?
Yeah, unfortunately, the 8 students have not joined, I think.
Yeah.
So
they got the new time, huh? Because changed to Monday, 4 o'clock.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, the 8 students, I don't see their names yet. So they have to be here because they are participating here.
I'm trying to text one of them.
Are they having classes still?
The class must be finished around 10 minutes ago.
Oh, I see. Okay. Maybe the lecturer went a little bit longer. Yeah.
So before the meeting, I would like to introduce our team in physiology. We have Dr. Yuliati.
Hello.
Dr. Yuliati, please say hello to Professor Cheng.
Hello, good afternoon, sir. Sorry,
Hello.
I can. Yeah.
And
thank you, Dr. Aksa.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Yuli. And the second one is maybe you have known her because she is very active in the Indonesian Physiological Society, Dr. Anis Irmawati.
Hello.
Good afternoon, Prof. Cheng.
Hello, Anis. Yes, I think
How are you, Prof?
Yes, I think I remember meeting. I cannot remember where.
Oh, where are you now, Prof?
At the moment in Malaysia, still, we cannot go very far.
Okay, alhamdulillah. Thank you for your join in this meeting.
That's okay.
Thank you for your.
Welcome. Yeah.
Okay. I think enough, Dr. Raksa. Thank you.
Ya, thank you. Mahasiswanya kok belum.
I just text one of the 8 students, the Mensa, the leader. He told me he's ready, but I don't see his name.
Yeah. Oh, maybe they have wrong information about the room.
Yeah, because he said he's ready, so but I don't see his name.
It always happen. 59. Menza just text me that they got wrong information about the room.
Oh,
now
okay.
they are entering the room. They are coming here.
Okay, good.
Yes. We will start this meeting in 5 minutes. Please, the students, please ask your friends to join this room as soon as possible, because Professor Cheng is already here, especially for the students who are assigned to be involved in the delivery of the Professor Cheng's presentation.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the students are coming in. They probably
I saw Miza, and
yeah. So I think they got the wrong link, I think.
Dr. Raksa, excuse me.
Yes.
Here is Hwee. Hwee is leader of the 2021.
Okay.
Hwee.
Okay. Hwee, please ask your friends.
Untuk Hwee di bahasa Inggris.
Hwee, please make some note of your friends that make sure that they all are attending this meeting. Yeah, please make some notes that some of them, if you find that some of them don't join this meeting. if you find some of them are not here. Now 97 participants join. We still have 5 minutes, 4 minutes.
So Dr. Aksa, if you could make the 8 students panelists so that they can take part during the talk.
Okay.
Right. Thank you.
I think everybody can share their.
Oh, I see.
Presentation. Yeah.
Okay. Good.
Dr. Aksa,
Yes.
it's nice virtual background.
Oh yeah.
For student, simple but elegant, I think.
Oh yeah. Thank you. So 2 minutes to go. 178. I think most of them is already here, Professor Cheng.
That's
so
great.
Maybe we can start in 1 minute. It's okay.
Yes, please. Yeah. Thank you.
I will open the meeting first, and then I will give you the time.
Thank you so much.
So I think the time is up. I think I have to open this meeting. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. The Honorable Dean of the Faculty of Dental Medicine, Universitas Airlangga, the Honorable Professors and teachers and lecturers of the Department of Oral Biology, Universitas Airlangga, the Honorable guest lecturer here, Professor Hwee Ming, and all the students. Today, the Faculty of Dental Medicine, Universitas Airlangga organized a very interesting interactive lecture by inviting a guest lecturer who have a global reputation in the field of physiology. His name is Professor Dr. Cheng Ming from the Department of Physiology, Faculty of Medicine, University of Malaya, Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia. Professor Cheng is a remarkable physiologist who has been invited to share his knowledge in many countries. He also has been a visiting lecturer in the many universities in Indonesia. Last time I attended his online lecture in Universitas Hasanuddin a couple of weeks ago. I know Professor Cheng quite well, and I met Professor Cheng in personal. Last time we met in Kobe, Japan, 3 years ago, yeah, Professor. And Professor Cheng is such an inspiring educator, as he has a unique methods to involve the students during his presentation. I think I have to share his curriculum vitae. You can read by yourself. Professor Cheng, Hwee Ming, date of birth, April 27th, 1958. He obtained his academic degrees, all of his academic degrees in the University of Liverpool in the UK. Most of the books that he wrote, almost of the books that he wrote about education. So he is recognized as the good educator in the field of physiology. You can see so many books of education. So Professor Cheng also published his own articles in journals, so many articles that he wrote and have been published. You can see the list of his publications. I cannot mention it one by one, so you can read by yourself. And Professor Cheng also external examiner for physiology in the numbers of foreign universities in India, and also the Sultan Kapus universities and other universities in Malaysia. Also, he has been assigned as a visiting lecturer in some foreign countries, including China, USA, and Japan, Kagawa University, and then Turkey, Thailand, and China. So he also have delivered presentation in the numbers of universities in Indonesia. Yeah. And then he also have been awarded by the University of Malaya as the best preclinical lecturer 2 times in the year of 2014 and the year of 2016. Okay. He also supervised some PhD and master students. I think the curriculum vitae is very impressive. So I just because we have a very limited time, I give Professor Cheng the opportunity. The time is yours, Professor Cheng.
Thank you. Yeah, just to check first my level of my speaker. Is it loud enough?
Is it okay, Professor Cheng?
It's okay. Yeah. Okay.
I can hear you.
Thank you, Dr. Aksa, for that introduction. And I'm very happy to be back again. I gave one talk in May, May the 1st, I think, to the same dental school in Airlangga. And this was on neuroendocrine control of blood pressure. So this afternoon, in quite a brief time, because I also will involve some of your classmates in my talk, we will look at 2 aspects of physiology that all dental students would obviously pay more attention to in terms of physiology. Some areas of physiology are not as core essentials, like maybe the renal system. But in cardiovascular physiology and respiratory physiology, these are two important ones. And so today's title, if you have noticed it, I try to use a two-word, breath and blood. That means respiratory and cardiovascular system. And I hope, so basically we're talking about cardio-respiratory integrated system. And I like your background, which I just noticed, the red background with the slogan, physiology is fun. Yeah, so basically that's one of my key areas of trying to make physiology fun, although it's not an easy subject to understand and appreciate. It takes a little while, but at least in the process of learning, it can be fun. And I hope that this afternoon's brief lecture involving some of your classmates will help to make some of those points here. So I'm going to share screen now and then just take you through. I hope it can be done. Let me see, share screen. Okay. Okay, so can you see my slides? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So this title here is slightly different from today's title, blood and breath and blood. But basically, it's a similar talk I gave actually just a couple of weeks ago to University of Ganesha in Bali. So that was the emphasis too on cardio-respiration. And I decided to choose this title at that time, cardio-respiration along the bloody river of life. So our blood flow is obviously a river of life. So we use that analogy. So obviously along this pathway, we're thinking about two major areas that we need to take note of in terms of the importance of exchange of the respiratory gases. One is obviously in the lung, and the other one is in the tissue or in the muscles, which make up much of a tissue. So let's proceed. So there are a lot of numbers here, and this is what students will face as they first encounter respiratory physiology. And not all values in physiology need to be memorized because there's always a range, quite a wide range. But in terms of the values for partial pressure of oxygen, as well as carbon dioxide, these are universal values, which means that these values are very similar if I test your blood and if I test my own blood. So they are worth memorizing, if we can use the word, so that when you have to discuss about the partial pressure values and the gradient especially, because movement of gases, whether it's oxygen or CO2, requires a partial pressure gradient. So we will focus on the first part mainly on oxygen gradient. So, and the first part we look at is the lung. So there's always a gradient, partial pressure gradient, 105. Some books, most books say 103, 104, but it's at least 100, slightly more. And there's always a large gradient, 105 and 40. Sorry, 40 here. The deoxygenated blood that enters the lung. So this gradient is important for the oxygen to diffuse. And same thing for CO2. You also have a gradient, but it's much smaller. So it's 46 to 40. It's only 6 difference, whereas for oxygen is 60. So at least 10 times partial pressure gradient. And this is because CO2 is much more soluble in the blood, and so you do not need as great a gradient. It's sufficient for essential removal of CO2. So these are values which are quite essential to remember. It makes your explanation more complete if you can mention the value. These are partial pressure value. So gases will only move if there is a partial pressure gradient. And we don't have time to look at the basic physical chemistry. So the partial pressure is obviously according to Henry's law that you would have done perhaps in school. Yeah. So so this is a picture of the, and then we look at the lung first, the site of exchange, and then we will look at the tissue. We look at the tissue and using the example of the muscle tissue. So let's move on. So just to remind you about oxygen transport. So the yellow balls here would represent in this picture of two chambers, partial pressure of oxygen. And so in the first diagram, it will be equal partial pressure, equal number of oxygen dissolved in the plasma. Okay. Now in this case, the blue ball will represent hemoglobin. And so hemoglobin obviously binds strongly to oxygen. And so very quickly it will attach the oxygen here. And so when that happens, you find that now the number of free yellow balls, so the one in solution is the one that contributes to partial pressure. Any oxygen which is bound to hemoglobin no longer contribute to what is known as partial pressure. So now you have more yellow balls, free yellow balls, and on this side of the border, you have less free yellow balls. And so this is what we mean by a partial pressure gradient. And so the yellow balls will continue to diffuse until you find a situation where the number of free yellow balls representing partial pressure oxygen becomes the same. Now, obviously, if you look at the picture, definitely on this side, there is more oxygen content, right? But most of it is associated with hemoglobin. But the partial pressure is the same because the free yellow balls is the same. So the 2 points here is that when you think about partial pressure, it only refers to the dissolved oxygen, okay? But obviously, hemoglobin, by binding to oxygen very quickly, is able to increase the total content on this side. And the diffusion of further oxygen will not occur if the partial pressure becomes the same. 2 free yellow balls, 2 free yellow balls. But the amount of oxygen which will bind to the hemoglobin is dependent actually on the partial pressure or the amount of oxygen dissolved in the plasma. So there is an equilibrium, a reversible equilibrium between hemoglobin oxygen saturation and the partial pressure oxygen. We'll come to that in a short while, and when we look again at the oxyhemoglobin association and dissociation curve. So the point here is that partial pressure oxygen refers only to the dissolved oxygen and not to oxygen which is bound to hemoglobin. Okay, so again, this is just to highlight the values which are worth remembering. This is venous blood, this is arterial blood, and then in the alveolus, again, this value is here, and then in the atmosphere. Okay, so as we said, there is always a gradient for diffusion of oxygen, and there's a gradient, much smaller gradient for the diffusion of CO2 out into the lungs. Now, this is basically the same thing, but just to highlight again. So this one single line, just to simplify, it's not just one line. Obviously, this alveolar capillary membrane in the lung consists of the alveolar epithelium, the interstitial fluid, the capillary wall of the pulmonary blood vessel, and then obviously the plasma component before the oxygen diffuses into the red cell. So actually a multi-layer, but we just simplify the oxygenation by saying alveolar capillary membrane. And that layer, even though it's made up of several membranes, as well as the interstitial fluid, is very narrow. So it's not a problem in terms of the passive diffusion of oxygen. And so here again, is just to highlight the partial pressure gradient, about 60, and this is C. Now, there is a term that you may encounter, and this is called the diffusion capacity of oxygen in the lungs. And the symbol given here is DLO2. The L symbolizes the lungs. Okay, so it's a diffusion capacity of oxygen in lung. And this is given by this relationship, the amount of oxygen you can download in the lung, or you can use the word download, or uptake in the lung into the blood over the partial pressure gradient. Okay, and this partial pressure gradient is obviously the one in the alveolar, which is about 105. I put 100 here. And I put a question mark here because we will see in a short while that this one here, PVO2, is not a single value for T, because this value will very soon increase along the capillary, so that as it increases, the gradient becomes less and less very quickly. Okay, we'll show you one graph in a short time. At the point of entry, this is the largest gradient. But along the capillary, as the oxygen comes in, this value becomes 50, 60, 70, 80, and so the gradient becomes less and less. And you reach a point where you no longer get further oxygenation if you do not have the partial pressure gradient. Yeah. So so this afternoon, as I said, some of the students have been in discussion with me, and they will present you two physiodrama, one in the lung and one in the tissue, to illustrate, hopefully in a more enjoyable way, physiology is fun, the components of the blood that are involved in the uptake of oxygen. So at this point, let me just maybe share the next slide. So here you are. These are your friends that you recognize. You know them. This is Andre, and yeah. So I cannot remember all their names, but they will introduce themselves and the part they will play in this physiodrama, and they have a good introduction. So I basically will just. But let me tell you that so that it helps you to appreciate. The drama is very short. One of them will be the narrator, Andre, and then he will also play the part of the alveolus. And then you have Pravina here playing the role of the red blood cell, and so on and so forth. And there's somebody who plays the role of hemoglobin, Sania. Oxygen will be played by Ursaya, okay, and then Anning playing carbon dioxide. Menza will play the role here of proton, and blood flow is by Zaki here, I think. And then the second part of the physiodrama, we will have the muscle tissue, and one of them will play the role of the muscle, and that is Zanira. So without further ado, let me stop sharing here, and they will show you the first part of this physiodrama. Okay, right.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Doctors, permission to share screen the video. Okay. Is it visible now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Today, we will bring to you our cardiorespiratory drama, where we follow blood flow and its friends to walk through to see what happens in our lungs and our muscle tissues. But first of all, let me introduce to all of our cast. First of all, there's me, Andre, as Alvin the Alpheolus, and as the narrator, of course. Second, we have Pravina as E-Red. Third, we have Ersia as Oxy, and then we have Anning as Kobe, and then we have Menza as the Proton, we have Sania as the Hemo, and then we have Zaki as Blood Flow or BF, and then last we have Zanira as Mayo. Let's follow them through to see what happens in the lungs. Welcome to Fresh Air Trans Lounge.
Wonderful, we have all arrived.
Wow, that's a nice electric red car.
Yes, it is. And we have called our electric red car as E-Red.
Who are the passengers?
Hi, I am Himo in the front seat of E-Red, and my co-passengers are Oxy, Kobe, and Proton.
I am going to get a top up here.
Let me out! I want to get some fresh air.
I think I will follow Kobe.
Hey, who's driving this beautiful E-red car?
I am the only one who drives this A-red car. I am Himo's BF.
Okay, thank you, the Mensa, for sharing that. Yeah, so I hope you can appreciate. I'll try to explain the dialogue, the physio dialogue, as we continue to explain the physiology. So, for example, what is this? Oxy is saying, I'm going to do some downloading here, basically referring to the uptake of oxygen into the blood. Okay, so let me continue with my talk. So I'll share screen again. Okay, so now when students are presented with a graph, very often with my own students, they also don't quite like looking at graphs. But the graphs are important in physiology. So I hope that in the course of your learning physiology, you get comfortable with looking at graphs, because graphs present a lot of information. So so this on the x-axis, first of all, look at the axis. So this is basically what happens in the lung. Okay. So you have the length of the capillary, pulmonary capillary, represented by arbitrary number. And then you have the alveolar partial pressure at 100 here, or 105. And then this is the entry point, as I mentioned, the venous blood. Okay, so the venous blood will have a partial pressure of about 40. So there's always a very large gradient, partial pressure gradient for diffusion. But just look at the green line first. But you notice that along the length of the capillary, the equilibration is achieved very rapidly, so that in half the time the blood is exposed to the oxygen, it is already saturated or equilibrated with that value. And so further along this point is what we mean by saying that you will not get any more further oxygenation, because there is no longer any partial pressure gradient. Oxygenation only occurs here. Okay, and so as I mentioned in the last slide, the gradient actually decreases very rapidly until this point where no further oxygenation occur. But if you want to deliver more oxygen to the cell per time, you can actually increase the blood flow, or the BF, into the lungs, so that when you introduce more deoxygenated blood per time, then you present the partial pressure gradient for oxygen for further oxygenation. Okay, so this is a picture, and so this is your alveolar capillary membrane is here, and this is rapid oxygenation. And of course, in the lungs, CO2 is given out, as you saw in the physiodrama, and there's also the mention of proton. Now, proton normally, the pathway for proton in respiration, cardio respiration, always follows carbon dioxide. And that is why in the drama, Proton Mensa says, I think I will follow CO2. And we'll come to that in a short while, why the movement of proton follows the movement of CO2 in cardio respiration. And so this is basically what happens in the pulmonary capillary. So let's move on. So there are also, besides graph, especially in some system, you need to become comfortable with some basic relationship of how to calculate total amount of oxygen delivered to the tissue. So if you're thinking about the head and neck region, which is your interest for dental students, it's the same formula for any tissue. So obviously, one is that if your lungs are normal, there will be a normal oxygen content. And this is a ml of oxygen per ml of blood. And then even if the blood is well oxygenated, the important concept in cardio respiration is that the blood must flow. Because if oxygenated blood doesn't flow, it's useless for the tissue. So blood must flow. And there is a kind of hypoxia which is experienced by the tissue if the blood flow is not good, even though the oxygen content is good. And we call that, you may have learned this, stagnant hypoxia, because it is a problem with the blood flow. And so if you want to calculate amount of oxygen delivered to the tissue, you use the oxygen content and you multiply that by the blood flow, which is the cardiac output. And so to give you some values, the arterial blood content is roughly about 20 ml per percent per 100 ml. So here is a symbol that is used. This looks like CO2. It's not CO2 because it's got a subscript here. So if you see this, it means the oxygen content in arterial blood. Okay, if you want to say oxygen content in venous blood, then there is a subscript V here. Okay, so this represents the arterial blood content, the first one. And if you multiply that by the cardiac output, normal cardiac output in a 70 kilogram male adult, the benchmark is 5 liters per minute or 5,000 ml per minute. And so if 100 ml, you have 20 ml of oxygen. This means that in order to calculate this, you times you times 50. So this gives you a normal resting delivery rate of oxygen to the tissue of 1,000 ml per minute. So this is roughly the value of amount of oxygen delivered to all the tissues per minute. Okay, distributed by the cardiac output. Okay, this is again, so focus with me on the left side. This is about CO2, and this is not CO2, oxygen. So here the values refers to the rate of oxygen delivery per time. And as I just mentioned, this 1,000 ml of oxygen should actually be 1,000 ml per minute. Okay, this is calculated from oxygen content multiplied by cardiac output. And so you notice that for this normal cardiac output, at rest, you find that only 1/4 of the total oxygen is used up by the cells. Okay, and so in the venous blood, you still have a 3/4. So although we call it deoxygenated blood, it is not the same meaning as depleted blood, because it is still very highly saturated. And we will see in a short while that deoxygenated venous blood is still 75% saturated with oxygen. So it's just that normally you only used up 1/4. And obviously during exercise, this portion which is taken up by the cells will be greater. But normally there's a big reserve because from the 1,000, you only use up 1/4. Okay, so these are values for oxygen. I will come to the cells in a short while. So let's move on. Okay, so now we come to the tissue at rest. This is the value, 250 ml of oxygen per minute. Okay, out of the 1,000 ml per minute. And so the extraction rate is about 25% normally at rest. So if you are asked what is the venous oxygen content, CO2 with the subscript V here, it will only be decreased by 25%. Yeah, only 25%. There's still a big reservoir of oxygen in venous blood. Okay, so the definition of how language can affect our understanding of physiology is quite important. So again, these are some values. This is 1 liter of blood now. So in 1 liter, you have 200 ml of oxygen. This is similar to the value I gave earlier. 100 ml will have 20 ml. So 1 liter will be 200 ml. And a small proportion is only dissolved in the plasma, very much smaller. But as we saw in the first few slides, the dissolved oxygen is the one responsible for the partial pressure. Okay, and what is bound to hemoglobin does not contribute to the partial pressure. But what is dissolved in the aqueous plasma is in equilibrium with the oxygen which is bound to the hemoglobin. And so there is a reversible relationship between partial pressure of oxygen and the amount of oxygen that can saturate hemoglobin. We'll come to that in another graph. Okay, so again, this is the value I gave to you, about 1,000 ml per minute. So back to this picture again, because it is quite important to appreciate the difference between total oxygen, which is obviously more here, and the partial pressure of oxygen represented by the free oxygen dissolved in the plasma. And there's an equilibrium between the dissolved and the bound. Okay, so with this, let me ask the actors to come back again. And this time, it's very similar drama, except that now instead of alveolus, we have Mayo. One of the student will be the Mayo, and the conversation is just slightly different. So see whether you can catch any of the difference. And this visual video is now, I think, is now in YouTube, if I can remember. And so, please contact the students who are presenting here. I'm sure they'll be happy to share you the video, the YouTube, and so you can view it again. And hopefully, after this talk, you can appreciate the dialogue more. Okay, so let's move on and ask the 8 students to come back and present to us the second part of this visual drama. Okay, I'll stop sharing here. Okay. Yep.
Okay, Doctor, thank you. Permission to share screen the video. Is it visible now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Doctor.
And now let's continue our journey to see what happens in our muscle tissues.
Welcome to Motion Pictures, where the action is.
Wonderful, we have all arrived.
Wow, that is a nice electric red car. Yes, it is. And we have called our electric red car as E-Red. Who are the passengers?
Hi, I am Himo in the front seat of E-Red, and my co-passengers are Oxy, Colby, and Proton.
I need to do some downloading here.
Nice place. It feels like I'm coming home.
I think I feel the same way as Colby.
Hey, who's driving this beautiful E-Red car?
I am the only one who drives this A-red car. I am Himo's BF.
Okay, thank you. Right. Okay, thank you. Yeah. So, so you remember that in the lung, the oxy, the person says, I need a top up here. Basically, that's oxygenation. And then now in the lung, oxy says, I think I'm doing some downloading here. Basically, downloading oxygen to the tissue. Yeah. And in the lung is a fresh air transit lounge. You remember, because that's where ventilation is. And CO2, Kobe is CO2, says, I need to get some fresh air. I need to get out. And proton always tends to follow CO2. We'll come to that in a short while. And then now in the cells, the Kobe says, oh, it feels like home here, because this is where CO2 was originally produced. And proton again says, I feel the same way as CO2. Now, you're wondering why proton always seems to follow Kobe. We'll explain that towards the last few slides. So basically, these are the two important exchanges. And blood flow BF is a play on boyfriend. I don't know whether you caught the humor there. The blood flow is very important. We're talking about cardio respiration. You not only need oxygen content, which is normal, you need the blood to flow. Because if the blood doesn't flow, as I said, one of the conditions you get is stagnant hypoxia. And just to mention here, and I'll explain in a short while, there are always these 3 passengers together with hemo. And this is oxygen, obviously, always with hemoglobin. There's also CO2, and there's also proton. These 3 molecules are always there with hemoglobin. Okay, so what we are saying is that even in oxygenated blood, when we talk about oxygenated blood, sometimes we have the picture there is very little CO2. Actually, there's quite a lot of CO2. even in arterial blood. And there's also proton bound to the same hemoglobin molecule. Hopefully this becomes clearer in one of my summary slides at the end. But anyway, this is just some explanation of the physiodrama. I hope you've enjoyed it. I actually enjoyed the drama very much. I wrote the dialogue for them, and I think they've done very well. And I've asked for their permission so that I can perhaps use it for some of my future talks. Yeah. Okay, let's continue. Let me share screen again. Okay, so now we come to another graph. You can't run away from graph. Recently, we had a talk by Professor Linda Costanzo. Some of you may be familiar with her textbook. She's a very popular textbook author. And her talk that we organized was basically about how to learn physiology better. And one of the things she made is that students should learn to feel comfortable with graphs. He says one of the best way to learn physiology. Once you do not get upset or the graphs does not repel you at the first instant, once you begin to enter into it, there's a lot of information that you can derive from it. And so this oxyhemoglobin graph actually represents a lot of oxygen physiology, because as we notice, most of the total oxygen content is bound to hemoglobin. So look at the x-axis again. So this is now partial pressure of oxygen, okay? The one dissolved in plasma. And this one here represents amount of hemoglobin that is saturated. So from obviously 0 to 100%. And so you have two values here. One is arterial blood, which is represented here, okay? So which is about 100. And so the saturation is obviously about 100%. Okay, normally arterial blood. And as I said, the second value here is 40. This is venous blood, partial pressure oxygen. As I said, the special relationship between oxygen and hemoglobin shows you not a linear graph. Because if this graph was linear, if this dropped by 60, then the partial pressure should drop by 60. So you should actually get just 40% saturation. But because of the unique relationship between the 4 subunit of hemoglobin oxygen, you get this sigmoid shaped curve. So that in the venous blood, although it drops to 60, 160, you still get, as I said, 75% saturation. So the saturation in the venous blood has only dropped about 25%. There's still a very large reserve of oxygen that can be used when the muscles or the tissues are more active. At rest, you only used up 1/4. About 25%. The content dropped by 25%. The saturation also dropped by 25% because most of the content is associated with hemoglobin. So let's move on. So this is, okay, these are just some words which I will leave with you to read. It's from the same set of PowerPoint slide. So this basically explains what we've been talking about. This is another picture showing you the 4 subunits of hemoglobin and the special relationship. We call this a cooperative effect, so that you get this sigmoid curve, so that when it drops from 100 to 40, you only drop about 25%. And if you take another value, when it drops from 100 to 60, a drop of 40 millimeter mercury, the saturation is still 90%. And this actually is important because there is a very large margin whereby when the patient's saturation, partial pressure drops from 100 to sometimes 80, actually is still very within a fairly comfortable range for the patients to actually recover quite well because the saturation is still very high. Okay, so the two axes here is different. This is just saturation. And this one is just expressed in oxygen content per 100 ml. So this is a value, as I said, normally in arterial blood is 20 ml of oxygen per 100 ml of blood, representing the close to 100% saturation of hemoglobin. Okay, so let's move on. Okay, these are just, since we are involving some of your students, these are a group of students that have now graduated. And so this represents our multiracial society. So you have one Indian student here, some are Chinese students, and a few Malay girls. And so they have graduated successfully, and some of them have moved on to good career in their medical vocation. Okay, now, so you remember the physio drama about Oxy saying that I'm going to do some downloading here. Now, I want to introduce another important concept about hemoglobin and oxygen. Hemoglobin obviously has a very strong affinity for oxygen. And we sometimes think that if the affinity for hemoglobin is increased, that will be better, right? Then you bind more oxygen in the lung. But one of the important perspective is that you always need to see things from the point of the cells, the cell, because the cells are the final target or the consumer of your oxygen. And also the cells are the one that releases the CO2 to be released. And so from the perspective of your cells, if I ask you a question, which I can't do in this online format, would it be better for hemoglobin to have less affinity for oxygen at the cells or more affinity? Actually, the answer is less. So let me summarize. Whenever the hemoglobin affinity for oxygen is reduced at the cells, it is always good for the cells because it means that there's more downloading of oxygen to the cells, and that always benefits the cell. Okay, and so so you think about what is happening. For example, there are a few factors that you see in your active muscle: increased hydrogen ion because there's lactic acid and so on, increased PCO2, which is obviously increased metabolism of your active muscle, increased temperature. Your exercising muscles are warmer, right? So keep in mind that the exercising muscle is slightly more acidic, it has a higher CO2, and it also is warmer. So all these three conditions in your active muscle would logically, physiologically, download more oxygen from the hemoglobin. And this is precisely what happened. All these three conditions which you find in the active muscle will decrease the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen. And so you get more extraction of hemoglobin, of oxygen from the hemoglobin. Now I'm going to show you a few graphs, which is always found in textbook, about how this is represented graphically in the way in which the standard oxyhemoglobin curve shift. Okay, and let me go back one step here. So now one of the index which is used is this 50% saturation. Okay, so normally if you draw a line to 50% saturation, the partial pressure which is needed is about 27. Okay, so this is one value that we call P50. The normal P50 at rest is the minimum partial pressure of oxygen that will give you 50% saturation, and the value is 27. Okay, so if I ask you now, if the P50 increases, let's say to 30, it means that you need a greater partial pressure to achieve 50%. That means the graph would have shifted to the right. Okay, so if this graph is shifted to the right, if we draw the 50% point, that point will now match a higher PO2. Your P50 has increased. So to summarize, if the oxyhemoglobin curve shifts to the right, it means your P50 is increased. It also means that the affinity of the hemoglobin for oxygen is reduced. Because if you need a greater partial pressure, if you need a greater partial pressure to achieve 50%, it must mean that the natural affinity of the hemoglobin for oxygen must be reduced. Okay, so this is where we look at this. So let me leave this for you to read. So just to highlight the shift of the curve to the right, which means more dissociation of oxygen, less affinity of hemoglobin oxygen, is described as Bohr's effect. Okay, so of the three effects, The Bohr effect describes the effect of proton or CO2. Okay, because there are three effects, right? Temperature, proton, and CO2. So if the effect of proton or CO2 is to dissociate more oxygen, this was originally described by this person called Bohr. Okay, so again, this is just the green. The yellow one is the normal one. Okay. Oh, sorry. Oh, sorry. Sorry. Oh, something wrong. So the yellow one is the normal dissociation curve. So just look at the middle one. So you see, if you increase the temperature, it moves to the right. And the lower one is if you decrease the acidity, it also moves to the right. Okay. If you draw another graph for CO2, if you increase the tissue CO2, it also moves to the right. So just remember, an exercising muscle is warmer, slightly more acidic, and has a higher CO2. And all these three conditions will decrease hemoglobin oxygen affinity so that more oxygen can be released to the cell. From the point of the cell, it is always good if hemoglobin has less affinity for oxygen. Okay, so let's move on. So this is just for some appreciation of your physiological heroes. This is Bohr effect, a very long name. I think he's from Denmark originally. So yeah, so let me summarize now, because from the point of the cells, hypoxia is always experienced when the cells lack oxygen. So there are a few categories of hypoxia. So as we said, even if your blood is well oxygenated, if the cells cannot use the oxygen, it is considered as hypoxia. So let's move from the bottom up. Histotoxic hypoxia, this happens when there is a metabolic inhibitor like cyanide poisoning. So although your blood is well oxygenated, your blood flow is good, but the cells cannot use it. So from the perspective of the cell, it is hypoxia. It's called histotoxic. Now, this is the one in red where we talk about the fact that if your heart does not pump very well in cardiac failure, although your blood is well oxygenated, the cells will still not receive sufficient oxygen per time. The rate of delivery has to be about 1,000 ml per minute, and it extracts normally 25%. So when this happens, we call it stagnant, is a better word, stagnant or circulatory hypoxia. Now, the second category is if the hypoxia is due to any changes in the hemoglobin. We call this anemic hypoxia. Either decreased concentration of hemoglobin. Obviously, if you decrease hemoglobin, you have less total oxygen. Or if the hemoglobin is abnormal, there's a mutation, it cannot bind as much oxygen. Okay, so we call this anemic hypoxia, representing any hypoxia that is due to changes in either the concentration of hemoglobin or the abnormality of hemoglobin. Now, just to highlight again, the main point is that in these three categories of hypoxia, anemic, circulatory, and histotoxic, there is no change in the partial pressure, PO2, because the partial pressure only refers to the dissolve. It's actually normal. Okay, there's nothing wrong with the ability of oxygen to dissolve in the plasma. Okay, so this now the first category is the only category where the hypoxia is due to a decrease in the PO2. For example, any causes of hypoventilation will decrease PO2, and this will cause something called hypoxic hypoxia. This is a very strange name to me because it's only one letter. It's almost as if there's something wrong with the typing. You type the word twice. Actually, it's called hypoxic hypoxia. Okay, so of the four categories of hypoxia, first category, there is a reduction in PO2. Second, third, and fourth, there is no change in the PO2. Second category is due to hemoglobin changes. Third category, blood flow. That's why blood flow, BF, is important. And the histotoxic is due to cellular poisoning. Yeah. So let me finish off by saying a little bit about carbon dioxide because of time constraint. So yeah, this is one of my cartoon. I hope you can like physiology is fun. So this is two cells taking a selfie. This is spelled as selfie. Okay, so the two cells are taking a selfie, and this is one of the main concept. Hypoxia is always defined from the perspective of the cell. Okay, so these are the four categories that we mentioned. Okay, so let's, the last few slides is just to highlight, we don't have time for, look at CO2 is different from oxygen. There is no special protein like hemoglobin that will bind most of the CO2. Now, if you look at CO2, it is carried in three forms. Again, a small amount is dissolved, and this represents the partial pressure of CO2. And this partial pressure of CO2 is now in combination, in equilibrium with CO2, which can be bound to hemoglobin. Remember I said, the hemo said, here are my three co-passengers, oxygen, CoB, and proton. Okay, so CO2 can bind loosely to the amino acid group in hemoglobin. And we call this carbamino hemoglobin, about 30%. But most of your CO2 is transported in a different form. To use corona language, CO2 is mask. CO2 is wearing a mask. And that mask makes it looks like bicarbonate. So if you look at bicarbonate here, HCO3, the CO2 is actually part of the bicarbonate. Okay, so this represents most of the CO2 which is transported in the disguised form. Okay, now we're going to look at the detail in a short while. So basically, there are three forms of CO2, which represents total CO2, dissolved CO2, partial pressure of CO2, carbamino CO2, and S bicarbonate. Okay, so the next slide is, I think, a little bit complex. So sometimes if students have not seen this slide, I would say, please fasten your seatbelt because it's quite complex. But anyway, here we are. Oh, sorry, these are just words. Now I'm going to mention something in a short while. This is for you to just read so that you can follow later. Oh, the other thing I want to also say that I will welcome you all to have my set of PowerPoint slide. I'll send it to Dr. Aksa so that you don't feel that you did not take notes fast enough. Okay, so this set of PowerPoint slides, you're welcome to have it, and so that you can read this at your own leisure. So when we talk about CO2 transport, there's another person called Haldane. And this is obviously another person important in physiology. Bohr effect is in oxygen transport. Haldane effect is in CO2 transport. So let's move on. So here's the one that I asked you to fasten your seatbelt. Okay. So let me briefly explain what's happening. So here you have the tissue, the second site of exchange. So there's a partial pressure gradient always in the tissues of 46. In the capillary blood, at the point of entry is 40. It's only 6. But CO2 will now dissolve in the plasma. This represents the partial pressure of CO2. There will also be CO2 dissolved in the cytosolic medium because the water fraction of the cytoplasm. So this will be also partial pressure, the same. And then, as we said, CO2 is bound to amino acid group with hemoglobin. So we call this carbamino. This represents about 30%. But the most important quantitative aspect of CO2 transport is the conversion of CO2 in the cell by an enzyme which is only found in the red blood cell, not in the plasma. This is carbonic anhydrase. Okay, carbonic anhydrase converts this to carbonic acid, and then this is dissociated into your proton. And this is where your CO2 now becomes. CO2 is now disguised and masked as bicarbonate. And so the bicarbonate then it exchange with chloride in what is known as the chloride shift. And so most of your bicarbonate in your venous blood is actually derived from this hydration of CO2 to carbonic acid and the dissociation. And in the lung, the whole reaction is just reversed. Now, I just want to mention something about hemoglobin. Remember I said, Hemo says, I'm in the front seat, and here are my three passengers, oxy, Kobe, and proton. So at any one time, hemoglobin will always have oxygen, even in venous blood. Even in deoxygenated venous blood, it is still 75% saturated with oxygen. And obviously it carries CO2 as carbamino, and it also is a very good buffer shown here. Okay, so the proton, which is dissociated from here, binds to hemoglobin. So hemoglobin is a very important intracellular buffer in the red cell, so that your venous blood is not very acidic actually compared to arterial blood. It's only slightly less. And this is because of the buffering function of hemoglobin. So hemoglobin has at least three functions: bind oxygen, everybody knows that, carry CO2, buffer proton, and there's also one other action which not mentioned here, is that apparently nitric oxide can also bind to hemoglobin. And nitric oxide is a vasodilator. So when it arrives at the tissue, that helps to vasodilate the blood vessel and also contribute to the delivery of oxygen. So with that, I think I need to just mention this John Scott Haldane. So now that information is easily available, something for you for me to ask you whether J.S. Haldane knew Christian Ball, whether they live in the same time, because they described the importance of one effect on oxygen, the effect of proton and CO2, and the other one described the effect of changes in oxygen that affects CO2 transport. Okay? This is the Haldane effect. So something for you to look up, and if you find it, you can let me know. So I think, okay, this is my last slide, I think. Let me see. Yeah. Sorry. So in recent years, this is from one of my books. In recent years, we've tried to summarize small pieces of information, physiology information, into geometric form, so that hopefully students have a mental image and can appreciate concepts better. So here is the triad of, so we've called this diagram now combination of physiology and geometry. So it's called Hwee geometric diagram. So there's already a paper that we released, and happy to send to any one of you who request it. So this is a Hwee geometric diagram of hemoglobin. And as you saw here, this was the passenger sitting in front of the E-rate. E-rate sounds like erythrocyte. That's why it's called E-rate, the erythrocyte rate electric car. And then which was propelled by the blood flow. And so hemoglobin always have oxygen, always have CO2, and always have proton bound to it at any one time, whether it is in arterial blood or venous blood. Okay, and there is a relationship between CO2 and oxygen and proton, which is described by Ball effect and Haldane effect. Ball effect says that when you have more CO2 or proton around, you tend to dissociate more oxygen. You promote more dissociation. This is Ball effect. And Haldane effect says that when you oxygenate hemoglobin in the lung, you tend to release more CO2, which is obviously a good thing. So hemoglobin, as it becomes oxygenated, tends to have less affinity for CO2. Also less affinity for proton. That's why in the physiodrama, you find that proton always tend to follow CO2. So this is part of this reaction where the reaction is one way or another way, okay? So, so with that, I think this would, sorry, where am I? Sorry, going the reverse. So with that, I think I will stop here, maybe open for some questions. And I will send to Dr. Aksa this set of PowerPoint slide. And thank the students once again for a nice visual drama. So go back and see the YouTube again. I'm sure that Mensa will be happy to share with you. And hopefully you can appreciate it more after this talk. So thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Professor Cheng, for the wonderful presentation. One thing that I noticed from your presentation today is the physiodrama is very cool, very fascinating. Yeah. So I hope the way that you create enjoyable environment for your classes during teaching will, inspire all the teacher here. I believe that by the way that you teach, your students are happy to gain knowledge without any stress and pressure. Yeah, Professor Cheng, in many surveys in the Western countries, physiology is considered to be one of the most difficult subjects in medicine. I believe your innovation in teaching is, maybe can make the assumption is not totally correct. Yeah. Because we develop the enjoyable environment in the class. So now we come to the discussion session. So I encourage students to ask a question for Professor Cheng. Any question? Especially for the 8 students who have been involved and with Professor Cheng these days. If you are, maybe you can go for a chat section in the chat box.
Yeah, they are welcome to just unmute. I'm sure they can. They are not shy.
Yeah, you're welcome to ask your question through the chat box. So maybe I will give you a question before the students, Professor Cheng.
Okay.
About the role of the bicarbonate in transporting the carbon dioxide. Because the vital role of the bicarbonate in transporting carbon dioxide is, related to the function of the kidney. That the kidney also regulate the number of the amount of the bicarbonate. So I think if we have a broken kidney, our bicarbonate level will be going down, and the transportation of the carbon dioxide is lower, and then there will be accumulation in carbon dioxide and lead to the acidity situation. Yeah. How do you think about it? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So this is another integrated area that we encourage students to try to think across the borders. Yeah, crossing borders is a corona language, but crossing borders is a very important physiological language, because in the more traditional system, I think because the systems are done separately, after you move from one system, especially in physiology, there's a tendency for students to try to segment their understanding, and especially if the modules have been examined already. So since it's not going to be examined, so you don't want to think about it. But there are actually many areas of integration. For example, let me give you a few examples. One is that cardio respiration is what we talked about today. It's very important. You need to integrate the two. The other one is cardio-renal. When you try to understand blood pressure, as I think this was presented as part of my talk in May, you need to not only think about the heart and the blood vessel, but also the renal function, because renal function affects blood volume and blood pressure. And with regard to Dr. Aksa's question, this is an area where you need to think about both the lungs and the kidney in pH control. Yeah, so this is what, so besides the chemical buffers in pH control, which are like frontliners, first responders to pH change, you have the respiratory function. So the lungs, by removing CO2, is not just removing metabolic waste, it is also part of controlling pH. Yeah, and as Dr. Asa mentioned, if you have already done renal, you find that the kidneys, one of the important function of kidney for pH control is to top up. We use the same word again, top up bicarbonate this time, because the kidney can make new bicarbonate for any bicarbonate that has been used up in buffering. And the kidney can also reabsorb almost totally all the bicarbonate which is easily filtered, because it is an essential base. So the most important chemical buffer in the body is actually linked to the renal system and the respiratory system. I don't know whether you're familiar with the bicarbonate carbonic acid, HCO3 over the carbonic acid system. So the carbonic acid is obviously linked to the level of CO2, is associated with the lung. And then the bicarbonate is linked to renal function. Yeah. So which means that your major extracellular fluid chemical buffer system, the bicarbonate carbonic acid ratio, is linked to renal function over respiratory function. Yeah. So that important integration is useful for you to appreciate how the body will respond to different acid-base balance here.
Okay, I think one thing that you have to remember for the student that every vital or every organs are connected and integrated to run their own function. Like just Professor Cheng mentioned that our heart, our lung, and our kidney, and anything else integrates their function together to running the physiological homeostasis in the body. Yeah. So this topics about the respiration is one example that transporting CO2 and oxygen is very vital with their own system. So it can be influenced by many other factors like heart and kidney and many things. Yeah. Any question from the students? Okay, I see two students raise hand.
Yeah.
I give the Nicholas first. Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Doctor, for the opportunity. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Nicholas. So I'd like to ask Professor Cheng Hwee Ming. But before I move on, I'd like to know exactly what is partial pressure. So I think that most of us still doesn't know what is partial pressure exactly.
Partial pressure.
Yeah, they use the word partial pressure because this is Henry's law. If you've not done this in pre-university, is if you expose liquid or water to a pressure of a gas at a certain pressure, the gas, if it is soluble in that water, will equilibrate between the gas phase and the liquid phase. And so the portion of the gas which is in solution, and obviously this represents the dissolved portion in the body fluid, that is just known as partial pressure. Okay, why do they call it partial pressure? Because air is, to calculate partial pressure, you take the total pressure and then you multiply it by what is known as the fractional concentration of that gas. For example, the partial pressure of oxygen in the air would be 21%, 0.21 multiplied by the total pressure is 760. So this gives you about 160. So that's why it's called partial pressure of oxygen in the inspired air. So it's a total pressure multiplied by the fractional concentration of that gas. Yeah.
Okay. Allow me to reiterate what Professor has just said. So partial pressure is the amount of pressure that is able to be done by the gas soluble in the liquid. Is it true?
Yeah. So what I was trying to get at in the example of the oxygen is that because oxygen, once it dissolves in the blood, very quickly binds to hemoglobin, and this is because the greater the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood, more would be the saturation of hemoglobin. So that what is not in solution, the bound oxygen to hemoglobin, does not contribute to that, what is known as partial pressure.
Okay, thank you, Professor,
Yeah,
for
sure.
Thank you. The next opportunity I will give to Rafael Raditya. Please ask your question briefly.
Hi, Rafael.
Thank you, doctor, and thank you, professor. All I want to ask, I want to ask about hyperoxia. So in the presentation, it is said that hyperoxia is described as the oxygen partial pressure in the arterial blood is higher than usual and can be fatal. So my question is hyperoxia the same as oxygen poisoning? And if so, what are the effects on the cells of having said hyperoxia? Thank you, Professor.
Yeah, so I didn't mention that, but it's there in the slide. Hyperoxia is obviously the reverse when there is an increase in the partial pressure oxygen. Sometimes that is done as part of therapy. So obviously, if the level of PO2 increases, if it is done acutely, it's not a problem. But if it is chronic hyperoxia, what will happen is that some of the oxygen, higher level of oxygen, can generate oxygen radical, and the oxygen radical they are actually quite reactive, and so can destroy your tissue. Yeah, but if it is used for a short time as temporary therapy, it's not a problem. Yeah. So, but hyperoxia just means increased PO2 in the blood.
Okay, thank you, Professor.
Okay, thank you, Rafael, for your question. And the next one, I see someone, Fitria Rahmi. Fitria Rahmi, you will ask your question from the chat or how? You ask me to give question from the chat. Okay, you can write your chat, or maybe are you ready with your chat?
Or just unmute and ask. It's okay.
Okay. By the time being, I have also request from Dr. Prativi. Dr. Prativi, one of our lecturer of our future full professor. She would like to ask you a question, Professor Cheng. Dr. Prativi, please. Hi. Proceed. Okay. Dr. Prativi, where are you?
Thank you, Dr. Aksa.
Okay.
Hello, Professor Cheng. Thank you for your fruitful presentation, Professor. Let me ask you, how about the cardiorespiratory failure symptom, Professor? As we can see, the cardiovascular respiratory symptom near to death in many patients. Could you give us insight about that, Professor?
I couldn't hear this is cardiorespiratory symptoms?
Yes.
My question about the cardiorespiratory failure, that the symptom including the cardiac arrest, is that true? And sudden cardiac arrest is the abrupt loss of the heart function. Would you explain us how the mechanism of the consciousness in sudden cardiac arrest in cardiorespiratory failure, Professor? Thank you.
Yeah, I didn't quite understand your question. This is in cardiac failure or sudden cardiac arrest?
Yes, that's right, Professor.
Yeah, of course, if it is any arrest, whether it's sudden cardiac, your blood no longer pumps. And so definitely from the point of the cell, the hypoxia which is experienced would be called a stagnant or circulatory hypoxia. Yeah. So although there may be no problem with the oxygenation, but unless blood flows, it is not useful for the cells. Yeah. So definitely the main concern would be tissue ischemia, and so this is like circulatory shock. We call it circulatory shock. So some circulatory shock obviously is due to loss of blood volume, hypovolemic shock. But in this case, it is a case of normal blood volume, but the blood volume is not flowing. Yeah. So I don't know whether I've answered your question. So it would be at the end of the journey, it is obviously whether the cells are receiving sufficient oxygen in terms of the rate of oxygen delivery per time. Yeah. So you not only need well oxygenated arterial blood content, but that total content has to move at a sufficient rate to the cells. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor. And I'm reading in many cases that the elasticity of the aortic wall become lower elasticity in patient in cardiac arrest. Is that related with the cardiac respiratory syndrome failure, Professor?
With normal aging, the elastic compliance is obviously reduced, and obviously in also certain vascular problem like arteriosclerosis. So the vascular compliance of the large arteries becomes reduced, and so that accounts for the increase in the systolic blood pressure because it's less elastic. But that one can be just an initial sign. So as long as the blood is still flowing, it shouldn't give you problem unless the blockage of the blood vessel due to the increasing arteriosclerosis prevents sufficient blood flow. Then when that point is reached, obviously, then tissue perfusion will be inadequate.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you, Prof. Cheng, for your explanation. Hopefully, special lecture like this we will get for you in next time.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank you,
Prativi.
Professor.
Yeah, thank you,
Dr. Prativi, for your question. Now I think this is the last question because the time is up. Professor Cheng, maybe you can read the question in the chat section.
Oh, okay. So let me do that. Okay. Other than the three molecules, oxy, Cobie, and proton, are there any molecules that come with them? Yeah, I mentioned in passing that the fourth function of hemoglobin is actually that it carries nitric oxide. Yeah, so this is now quite well established, and it makes sense because when the hemoglobin arrives at the tissue, obviously its function is to unload oxygen, and the nitric oxide is obviously a vasodilator. So when it arrives at the tissue, the vasodilation by the nitric oxide, which is released from the hemoglobin, obviously also enhances the oxygen delivery to the cell. So it all makes sense, yeah. So there are actually four functions of hemoglobin: carry oxygen, everybody knows. Carry CO2, not as well appreciated, but it's important, as you saw in that fairly complex reaction in the red blood cell as carbamino hemoglobin. Buffers proton is hemoglobin is a very good buffer. So that, as you saw, is part of the reaction in the red blood cell. And the last one is carries NO, nitric oxide, which is a vasodilator. I hope that answers your question, Fitri, Rama.
Okay. I think the question is already answered by Professor Cheng. I think that we come to the end of the session. Yes, Professor Cheng. Okay. This is the end of the session. Thank you, Professor Cheng, for your wonderful presentation. I believe it will be beneficial for all of us. Your idea, your inspiration for us to make a better situation in teaching in the class is highly appreciated. Okay, hopefully we could meet again in the next semester, in the next visiting lecture session. As you know, that Professor Cheng is our full-time staff in Bonn. Then Professor Cheng will teach physiology one time in each semester. Then inshallah, the next semester we will see again with the Professor Cheng in the different topic, yeah, Professor Cheng. Okay. Goodbye, Professor Cheng, and goodbye the student. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Yeah.
Soal mahasiswa bisa leave room karena roomnya akan segera saya tutup. Tolong komtingnya ya dicatat siapa yang tidak ikut ya. Silahkan leave room. Bapak Ibu dosen. Terima kasih atas partisipasinya mengikuti kegiatan visiting lecture dari Departemen Biologi Oral.
Ya, matur nuwun Dr. Aksa.
Terima kasih. Moga-moga semester depan
Ya.
farmako ada, mikro ada. Ya. Oke, saya tutup ya roomnya ya.
Ya, matur nuwun. Ditutup aja.
Terima kasih, Dr. Aksa.
Terima kasih, sama-sama.
Matur nuwun, Dr. Aksa.
Matur nuwun, Mbak Kadek.
Juli.
Nggih, matur nuwun.